Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Webinar Wednesday covering cost modeling and forecasting with Microsoft Project. I just want to take a brief moment to introduce myself. I'm Anna Castle, a Director of Marketing here at Advisicon. For those of you who haven't had the opportunity to learn a little bit more about Advisicon, let me take a brief second to tell you about us. We are a gold project partner with Microsoft, and we actually have over 20 years of experience in the project and portfolio space, covering a wide variety of industries. Our team is all about streamlining your project with a blend of methodology and tools. We are eager to come in and assist, and we like to view ourselves as your trusted partner. In fact, we have structured our departments to be your project management one-stop shop. That means we can train and consult, and we even author books. We are passionate about getting you the information you need in the format that works best for you. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out, whatever mode is most comfortable for you. We're happy to take your phone call, email, and even just validate any sort of issues you may be having. One last note about this session today. We are happy that you've chosen to spend some time with us, but we are also really wanting to make sure this time is effective for you. So if at any point you have questions or you need clarification, please utilize the question section in the control panel, and we'll do our best to address that throughout our session. And at this point, I will stop talking and happily introduce today's presenter, Advisicon President and Founder and Microsoft MVP, Tim Runcie.
Thanks, Anna. Hi, everyone. Let me turn my video on. It's always more fun when you can actually see who's the man behind the mask. And I've been hearing a lot of comments lately as I'm preparing for my annual journey to Lake Tahoe. I do an annual pilgrimage, spend a couple weeks there, disconnect from literally everything technology, and just really soak up some sun and what little water California really has left. But as one of my customers says, I'm getting my Grizzly Adams on with the beard here. They call it getting my grizz on. And for those kids at home that don't remember Grizzly Adams, that was a show in the 70s that guy had a big beard and a big bear. And anyway, we're here to have fun today, and so I wanted to just welcome everyone and help you begin to understand the power with Microsoft Project Server, some of the online components or on-premise components that really will deal around cost modeling and forecasting capabilities. So we're going to take a look, maybe a deep dive at some of the moving parts that are going to help you work through some of the elements that we have. For those that haven't met me before, my name is Tim Runcie, and I am a project MVP. I've been doing this for a very long time, very passionate about our community practice, so I encourage people to reach out with questions, sometimes just understanding how the tools work together with Microsoft or non-Microsoft. We'll talk a little bit about integration, because that's a very important part of understanding where data comes from and the importance of a project management system versus an ERP or an accounting system, and the elements that kind of go together. So I look forward to this presentation with you guys, and do remember we are going to take questions, so if you want to type those in the chat window, Anna will kind of record those, and when I pause, we'll actually take some questions for you guys. So hopefully we can answer as many as possible. And just to let you know, the topic today is pretty broad, and I'm going to keep this, within a narrow window of an hour. But do understand that this is a big subject, and in many cases in our advanced Microsoft project or advanced consulting and PMO work we do, we really help organizations transform their tools to supply some of the visibility that they need. And that's what I'm going to help us get in through today. So short overview of our agenda. We're going to understand the importance of cost modeling and cost forecasting, kind of what are the impacts and capabilities, as well as some of where the components lie and how they work. We'll get into some of the basic elements in project meeting that we'll go through and look at what's in a resource pool. We'll talk about online. We'll talk about custom fields. There's a lot of elements that kind of layer on top of each other, and that's important for you to understand how to leverage which ones, and also which ones you'll never need to bother with. So in many cases, this helps streamline that process for you. So as we go through, I'm going to do live demo. I think it's so much more important to actually see the tool, see it work, take it out there and go, if I can do this, you can do this. And again, I encourage you to ask questions, and we'll be pausing to do some little Q&A for our audience. So let's get in and talk about the importance of cost forecasting. And as you know, there are a lot of organizations that will go out. In fact, maybe even your agency or company is part of that, where they might use spreadsheets, or they might use some sort of a quadrant diagram, or they use some sort of convoluted math to do forecasting of work and cost. So inherently, we want to make sure that we use the correct tool, and then begin talking about how this really can support project, program, and portfolio management. So the idea, of course, we talk about importance and value, is the ability to do time-phased forecasting. Now, think about that for a moment. If we take a schedule, we take a project, we take a series of projects, we take a program, and usually what happens is early on in the portfolio management stage, you might be looking at budget and then figuring out which projects have the highest priority. And then from an estimation perspective, people might start throwing high-level darts at a wall, or saying, I think we need this, or I believe it's going to take 5 people 3 years to get this done. And so there's a lot of conjecture that goes around building out a schedule, and that's very normal in the pre-planning or pre-initiation phase. Sometimes we call the portfolio selection process. But at some point, it starts to drum down, or basically drill into elements that allow you to say, well, if I'm building a schedule, what I want to see inherently is work, materials, labor, hardware, software, licensing, and it's tied to some sort of a time-phase series of activities. And so if you think about scheduling, it's that's what people do. Hey, I got to do this work. Here's the resources that I need. And if you can marry those two pieces together, meaning I can track the work that's going on, I can look at the elements that are happening, and I can manage it like I do a regular project or a program, and have at the same time some of the byproduct of cost forecasting or cost actuals coming in, this becomes very powerful. Now, I know some of you that are here today also have to look at ERP systems, right? So we talk about the CFO or the CTO, both kind of looking at two different dimensions. And the CFO, the financial officer, or the organization is saying, hey, we're looking at budget, we're looking at revenue generation, and we have to kind of financially forecast. And we have a system of record. It's our, $30 million ERP system, or you've spent a lot of money with an accounting system that's not Microsoft, and yet what we have is this project management system that's nimble. It's easy to use. It gives you that time phase forecasting. And so then we get into the discussions between, say, CTO or CIO going, hey, I've got this forecasting tool, but you know what? I'm also having to do forecast modeling of cost. And so it's important, and I want to just kind of validate this, that if you have a system of record, we don't try and make your accounting system your project management system. And inversely, you don't try and make your accounting system convert over and suddenly become the project management system, or the project management system itself become your financial accounting system. The idea is that you want to use that better together story to blend the two together. And I'm going to show you elements that say, here's a great way to handle that, as well as some best practices or some conversational starters that say, listen, don't make your ERP system your PM system, and don't make your PM system your accounting system, but yet there's a nice way to blend the two in approach of both methodology, views, and reports. So as we get into kind of overviews and looking at real-time analysis, historical trending information, we can also look at scenarios like doing what-if planning with project, going, hey, if I drop this resource, bring in another resource, or we outsource this entire component, I can immediately begin to forecast and do what-if scenarios much better than typically you can in a large accounting or ERP system. So with that in mind, let's kind of think through some of the elements that we're going to need from a forecasting and project. So what I'm going to do, let me bring up good old project here, and we're going to talk about some of the pieces. Both will get into what I call the enterprise level. So I'm going to drag over and give you kind of a quick glimpse at a project online, or basically a project server environment. And of course, as we know that each of these rows in the project center, represent an entire project, or in some cases it could be a master project with nested sub-projects. When we talk about level of cost or level of forecasting for numbers, think at a project level, which is like the file level. We're able to kind of roll up and see what's the cost, what's that actual cost, what's the remaining cost, what's the baseline and variance, and add red, yellow, green indicators to help you basically plan for and showcase, are we ahead of schedule, behind schedule, what is our budget, and how does that work? So all of this data, whether you do it locally in a single file or you merge them together into an enterprise and hit publish, the basic raw elements are going to be very straightforward. We have project or file level fields that you work with at an enterprise level. And if you're in Microsoft Project, and let's say you're not in an enterprise approach, in many cases, if I click on my View tab, you'll see that we're able to kind of bring in a timeline, and we can kind of look at a high-level roll-up of activities and milestones. But if I also go up and say, listen, from a format perspective, let's add something called the project summary task. And that's this checkbox here on the right, which we commonly refer to as row 0. And the idea is that the entire file can roll up. So we're going to talk about budgeting. We're going to talk about roll-up and cost numbers. As you can see here, I'm showing kind of a little dashboard that says if we change hours, work, or perhaps cost, I can immediately see these graphical indicators rolling up and showcasing visually that we're ahead or behind work, cost, and schedule. And so again, from a row 0 perspective, which is kind of the file level, you have inherently kind of what we call project level values that we can see in that information. Now again, whether we dig a little bit deeper and start talking about task level information, looking at some of the things that go there, what I'm going to do is showcase some of the elements that actually make up the cost forecasting and modeling story and project. So let me right click, and if you haven't done this before, believe it or not, there's actually a cost table. So if I apply my cost table here, you can see fixed cost accrual, total cost, baseline, variance. Again, same thing that we get into when we start tracking actuals or work, and row 0 kind of rolls that information up from a project summary level. So if we think about some of the elements, let's talk about the task side of the house. So remember, project is a relational database, and that means that costs are derived from different places. So some of the things that people see is they go, oh, hey, look, there's my cost field. And so if I come over here and I just right-click, insert column, type in cost, I can go into a task and I literally can click on it and say, hey, this is going to be $450. And when I hit enter, I can see I've stored a value. Again, I can also talk about something called fixed cost, which is something that says, listen, instead of just overwriting all the values in the cost field directly, I can actually say, listen, I might be deriving costs from resources. I might be deriving costs from hardware or materials, or I might have labor. There's elements that I may want to factor in. But you know what? When we get down to our project party down here at the bottom, notice that there's 0 cost. But we're going to have a pizza party for everyone, and we're going to spend $120, and I don't want that to be factored into the labor of the people attending or the materials that I had to order to make that happen. So fixed cost is a column that allows you in project to say, hey, listen, I've got just kind of a separate place where I could just add miscellaneous type cost items. The reason I talk about fixed cost as a task column is that inherently what we don't want to do is build something into our resource pool and start assigning it to a task to track it. It's a lot harder to go, hey, how do I track the pizza and beer party for the team to let them blow off some steam from this huge multi-year project? Do I need to actually put a resource in project to forecast a model that we're going to fly everyone somewhere? Well, maybe you want to track travel, but then again, maybe you don't need to track the pizza, the food, or anything else that you're getting. And so the idea is that this provides a way for a project or program manager to say, from a fixed cost perspective, these are some things that we don't need to track in the resource pool, but yet I have some value. And as you can see here, it rolls right into our cost. It gets in over to our total cost. And anytime we make a change in any of the versions of projects, we get into having the ability for one or multiple views getting into what we call roll-up or roll-up information. Now, I'm going to turn on my Zoom It tool, and I think this is going to help us load and view information a little bit better. So if you look here in our project environment, the idea is I can quickly find, forecast, and see my information directly in that schedule. Now, as we go through, let's continue talking about some of the other moving parts that go around with project. So what I'm going to do now is transition a little bit out of what we call the dynamic roll-ups that we see at the task level, and let's go over to the resource sheet view. Now, if you're in an enterprise instance of project, the beautiful thing is you could certainly do exactly just that. You literally can come out and say, well, a resource pool is very similar to what we find and what we use directly with our project. So if you can do a resource pool in enterprise or you can do a resource sheet in project, you have some of the same modeling elements that all work for our benefit. So again, as you can see here, I've listed some of our team, and as you begin using some of the versions of project, you can actually come in and see, hey, listen, it actually has presence. It can see if we're available. I could link somebody and talk to them directly. But we get into identifying cost fields. Let's take a look here at the far right-hand side of the resource sheet and project. Again, enterprise resource pool would be the same thing. So we can get into something called your standard rate. And the standard rate column really is where if you come in and say whether I'm putting a burden rate because everyone just says we're not going to track their actual hourly salary, or perhaps maybe that's Privacy Act information. Then again, if you're with a public agency or you're with the state or a county, some of the stuff is public record, and so they'll put something like, hey, here's the hourly rate, government service level, step 7. But the idea is that when we track and put a resource on a task, and that resource has an hourly rate, then the hours of work that we're working with actually will come in place. So a good example here is if we're leveraging, high-level advanced developers, or if you want to grab, say, a portfolio manager who happens to be really cheap, like this guy Tim Runcie here, at $8 an hour. If I schedule him for 2 hours of work in my project schedule, it translates that into $16. So going through that, we see a few other fields. For example, if I bring over the overtime rate, something that a lot of people go, well, listen, I do need to track for work that's over 40 hours. I might have time and a half. And I'm going to tell you about this column. I'm actually going to show you how these work as we get into it, because overtime, great concept, and there's a purpose behind it. It has to do with under and over allocation, as well as tracking hours on a project. And again, if you are using overtime hours, you do want to have a different rate than your standard rate. By default, project calculates just all hours as part of the standard rate unless you call out specifically anything that is overtime. Then we also get into cost per use. Let me bring that over for you guys. The idea is that if I reach out and say, listen, I need to go ahead and pull in Armand, and Armand, every time I call him, charges me $25, and then his hourly rate is $125 an hour. What that means is, cha-ching, every single time you assign that resource to a task, there's a one-time flat fee. Now think about that for a moment. It could be hardware equipment you're doing the same thing that says, listen, there's just a one-time flat fee to use it. I don't need to track the hours or anything like that. So there's some flexibility of how we use our standard rate and our cost per use. Whoops, I put that in the wrong field. I don't think overtime would be 25, but if it's 25 here in overtime, or 25 in cost per use, the inherent idea is that that allows us to track a one-time cost every time we use it. And so as you begin thinking of creating your resources in project, you begin starting to plan around, hey, listen, here's an easy way that I can factor cost. I may not care what the vendor is, but every time I bring them in, it's a fixed price cost that we have. We have some organizations that do want to track whether a room is over or under allocated, or a piece of equipment might be over and under allocated. And while we do that, material and cost resources don't really look at over and under allocated. However, if there's a one-time charge that says, hey, listen, every time we use this room, we get charged a flat fee, then you can add that, and the standard rate, of course, might be 0. So as we begin looking at the resource pool, this is an important ingredient for what we're adding. And right now I'm talking about the columns, right? We're referring to just kind of columns that say, here's how they behave. But inside a project, there's a little bit more, and this is where we dig a bit deeper in what available options are. So we've talked about standard rate, cost per use, overtime, but then we get down into actually defining what kind of resources you're using. And I begin to allude to that where we might have vendors or rooms where we might say, listen, as I'm tracking what type of work it is it a work resource where I do want to see if something is over or under allocated? Do I want to or don't want to perhaps track it as material, meaning that I can list that out? And so again, we're going to look at some different scenarios of the different resource types. But before I go much further, there's a little very unknown or not commonly used area. And again, I don't use it a whole lot in a lot of the work that we do. But I'm going to insert a couple columns here, and we're going to talk about budget. So we have what's called, let's double click on that, budget work and budget cost. And you can see here if I add them. So I don't think I got it there. Budget, typing, cost. There we go. So I've got budget cost, and then I have another column that allows you to insert something called budget, budget work. And then we add the third column here, right click, insert column. I'm just going to say, is this a budget resource? Budget. And what I'm able to do is come in and say, listen, by default, everything is no. So what in the world is a budget cost, budget work, and what in the world is a budget resource? And let's think through that for a moment. A budget resource is only able to be assigned to the project summary task. What do we mean by that? Well, if I go back over to my Gantt chart, and let's just take a look here at my row 0, if I want to assign resources to a project summary task, so let's say I click on this and I click on the drop-down arrow and I try and add Armand and I click on OK, it's going to tell you only a budget resource can be assigned to a project summary task. The idea of a budget resource is I'm not setting baselines. I'm just kind of putting a high-level cost or high-level work that I'm able to kind of track by category so I can see what they are. So if I come back here, let me just cancel to our resource sheet view, and I go in and make a transitional shift that says, yes, I'm going to say travel is going to be a budget resource. And if I look at the overall cost here, notice how it enabled itself as soon as I click inside of here. If I want to add a value to travel to a summary, a project level summary task, let's go back to our Gantt chart. And I click here, and let's assign resources a different way. Let me just click on Assign Resources. Then while I can't go and click on Anna, who's helping me with this webinar today, notice that Assign is grayed out. When I scroll down and I finally get to Travel and I click on it, you notice that it's enabled, and we can actually assign travel as a summary activity, or to a summary task. So the idea is a high-level place for you to say, listen, I'm going to assign what are called budget-level resources. Again, not commonly used. Most time people will work through that. But the idea is that if once I assign it, I've got it, and I've already have it on a resource sheet. I have it in an assigned summary task. If I want to change that, I actually have to physically remove them from that assignment. So think about that, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into the hands-on practical component. Just want to talk about that briefly. Now, let's go back and let's talk about, in our resource sheet, what is our material, cost, and work resources. So in this case, as I go through here, we know that we have some sort of a budget cost and budget work that we can actually forecast with resources. What that really means is as you build a resource pool, whether it's enterprise, global, or local, is that the type of resources will help you define how costs are tracked and planned. And by that, what we're looking at is 3 areas here. And let me just click on the drop down, and I'll zoom this so you can see this. By default, the most common is what we call the work resource, meaning that we're able to see their availability based upon their calendar and their max units. That's used commonly for individuals, contractors, even rooms where you do need to see if it gets double booked and it crosses over a threshold during a period of time. We would use a work resource. But a material resource is where you can come in and just say, listen, I want to track the cost of a certain type of material. Now, if we were working with some of our wafer fab manufacturings, they might be tracking gold in their production line, which is pretty expensive. They might also have another type of material, which in terms of different types of items. So materials, and you can come in and say, well, the price of gold, I think, is about $1,130. Whoops, if I can type here, $1,130. There we go. It's $1,130. Every time we use an ounce of gold, or we use a 1 unit of gold, or if I'm tracking cubic yards or cubic feet or whatever it is, I can come back to a quantify measurable cost. Now, the problem with that, of course, is when you do materials and the price of gold goes up or down, or the price of steel in China changes, suddenly we have kind of these fluctuating costs. And that becomes very difficult to try and manage and track. So let me give you a little strategy around this. And again, we'll show you how this will translate. If I want to say, listen, I want to track a material cost. It's not an hour. It's not a labor. And I actually come over here, and let's just leave gold. And I'm going to put the word travel hyphen materials. And I make this a material resource, which I know we already have travel. We'll talk about that in a minute. And I say, listen, hardware, software, equipment, travel, it's all $1. Screaming deal. Go to the dollartree.com and you get your $1 value travel materials for your project schedule. Well, what happens is instead of you trying to figure out the price of gasoline or airline fuel or any of those elements, what we'll do is when we assign it and you know that there's a cost, you simply will type in the number of units, and that will translate to a total cost. So inherently, very commonly, we'll do this with customers. We'll set the material resources to $1, and that allows you to group materials or a type of resource that's not labor related, that's really saying how many units, and we really don't care how many uses because it's a fixed cost, or it's a cost that's a one-time estimate that we're planning for. So be thinking about that in terms of tracking materials and using a $1 option. Okay, I'm going to show you this in project. We'll kind of play around with some of it so you can see the value. Now, the third and final element here you're going to see is something called cost. And this is one of the most least understood values when it comes into working with project. I'm going to talk about this because there's some inherent behavior that really frustrates people when they use a cost resource. So when they added this several versions back, Microsoft's intent was to allow you to group cost-type resources. And simply, very much like we would use a material resource, we would simply enter the cost of the travel. So for example, if it's airfare, and we need to track all the airfare as a one group cost for our resources that are coming and going, then what we're able to do is apply a travel cost. And it makes sense. You would assign it to a task, you'd put in the number, and you'd be done. You wouldn't have to type in units. The problem that runs into is, if you haven't noticed this before, is that when you use tasks that have resources or mixed types of work or cost or material units, is that when you begin marking a task complete, it doesn't update the cost resources when they're mixed. Let's look at that in slow motion. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to hop over to my Gantt chart, and what I'm going to do here is let's go to just our standard entry table. And for keeping this very simple, let's go ahead and take a task that has no resources on it. So I'm going to click on Coordinating and Testing Activities with IT. Now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and look at it. It's got 4 days. So I'm going to go ahead and pick Chris. And when I click on OK, what I've got is Chris at 32 hours. Now what's nice about this is as I begin thinking in terms of both either work or cost, and in this case I'm going to go ahead and just say work, and then I'm going to right click and insert cost so you can see this, and then I'm going to go ahead and put in actual cost because that's what we want to watch. Actual cost, there we go. Let's watch this unfold. So as I click on our Coordinating Testing Activities with IT, perhaps I need to actually pull in some travel. So in this case, I'm going to pull in travel and say, well, we've got some on-site, off-site work that we need to do. And finally, I'm going to add one more element to this, which is my travel materials. Now again, remember, travel is a materials or travel is a cost resource. Let's watch how they behave. Now in this case, you notice that I'm actually looking at an activity. And when I put it in here, it says, hey, listen, it's $4,800 and $1. Now if I want to put in the cost of travel, I can change my detail, and again, I'm going to be going through some of these with you guys, and say, hey, for travel, by the way, it's going to be $300 for travel. And I click on OK, and you can see the overall cost is $4,800 plus $3 plus $1 material, right? So I'm going to leave that $1 in place so we can identify which one's the material and which one is the actual travel cost resource. So now that we have this in place, what happens as we begin progressing our work? Meaning that we start marking it at 50% complete. And as you start going through, if we think in terms of math, and like, for example, I've got $4,800 plus $300, that makes that $5,100 and $1. If I start doing math here and go, hey, 50% of 5,000 should be a minimum of 2,500. We know it's higher. Why is my math or my actual cost 0? And the answer is that when you use a cost resource on a mixed assignment, project will not update the actual values. We're going to talk about how to use that and how to use it correctly, because the value is if you have schedules and you want to track work and you have work resources and you have what we call cost resources, you can't mix and match the two. But for example, let me zero this back out to 0% complete. Let me go ahead and take my materials. I'll take it off, and I'll take Chris out of here, and I just click on OK. We know that there's a cost of $300 for travel, and maybe we're not tracking because it's all outsourced. We just need to make sure it gets done, but we're going to get a bill for $300. Now if I go through and begin progressing this, when there are no mixed assignments, a cost resource could actually do its percent complete, and it can take the actual value of your cost and carry that forward. And so I hear this all the time across organizations worldwide, from county to state to hospital to construction and engineering. All of them kind of wrestle with this value. And so if you really do want to use simply a cost resource, you're going to need a separate dedicated task for that. And as I'm showing right here, good tool just when you kind of have a mixed schedule or you have maybe a more efficient schedule. In many cases, people will simply opt to use a material resource, type in their units, and then they have their cost. So back to kind of talking about the elements inside of that resource sheet. Remember, we've got three choices here: work, material, and cost. And remember, cost, great product, great tool, certainly a value, but when you put it on a mixed assignment, you mark it done, it's not going to carry out those actuals. Now, as we continue to round out kind of the elements that we have inside of here, I want to wrap up with something called accrued at. I'm going to bring this over so we can all see this here. The idea is that when I start looking at time-phased schedules, and here's the beautiful thing, if you're building schedules in project, you're working, you're managing tasks, things ebb and flow, you want your work, your schedule, your deliverable, your dates to all move around, but it's also important perhaps for you to see when your costs are going to hit. Cost could be revenue, could be the actual cost of the work that's being provided. That could be tied to a milestone, and you're watching when a milestone payment is going to need to be made. We had a very large customer who actually was tracking work in their relicensing program. And as they begin looking at all the work and work activities, they had these deliverables that said you have to make an upfront payment. And if you miss that payment, it's $1 million a day fine. So I guarantee you they spent a little time doing some schedule and forecasting, but inherently what they were looking for is when did they actually have to make payments? And they used their schedule of work, initiative, and activities and these milestones tied to key deliverables to ensure that they had deadlines they were able to track and ensure that the work got done, but they monitored cost through the whole entire environment. And so that's where we look at this accrued at. Says, hey, listen, when I send the bill, meaning that when I start tracking hours or I start tracking the cost associated to work, labor, or cost on a Microsoft project task, is that work going to be at the start, meaning that we bill you all the way up front for the whole amount? Do we only basically accrue or basically show the actual work or when the cost will actually happen, both in planned and actuals at the end? Or is it kind of peanut buttered right through the middle, meaning that you've got this prorated? And so when you set up a resource, you can very clearly say, hey, listen, they do the work, and then 30 days later they get paid. Great, I can actually forecast from a cost or a modeling perspective by leveraging the accrued at. Now again, remember, if you're tracking in project and you're using prorated kind of peanut butters anything across the schedule. So now while you might zoom in at a day at a glance and that the hourly rate maybe isn't actually the cost that you're accruing, when you begin zooming out, you can actually see in a forecast what that looks like. And to give you an example, I'm going to just pop out into a resource usage view. And I'm going to go ahead and use my scroll to task button to kind of zoom out to where the work is. Now, I'm looking at work, but more importantly, maybe I want to start factoring what my cost is. So let me turn on cost. I'm going to right-click again and turn off work. I'm just looking at cost. The idea is that if at the end of your fiscal year you have deliverables or initiatives, does it make a difference if that resource that's assigned to a series of tasks, you're tracking hours and cost, if it's basically at the start, at the end, or is it prorated? And this is going to help you from a time phase perspective to actually see when that expected planned cost or actual cost will be coming in from project. Now remember, when we talk about ERP systems, accountants and CFOs get really squirrely about, hey, we've got a system of record where the actual real costs are. But remember, how long does it take to actually get all your actual cost in? So we usually have what's called month closeout, right? And so you might have a 30 or 60 lagging period before you actually see as a project manager what the real costs were. But what Project can help you do is track and manage what it should be based upon you building and managing a regular schedule. So let me turn on, in fact, I'll just leave cost here and I'll go back into my Gantt chart. So we've kind of talked at a high level about some of the elements that we have. Budget cost, we talk about assigning those. We looked at cost versus work, materials, and cost types in that resource sheet view. Again, from an enterprise approach, same thing applies. We also looked at some of the columns. So we have what are called rows or records that we can assign that allows me to quantify and group those. I also have columns that indicate what they look and appear at. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at a couple other native pieces, and then we're going to put these stories together and just kind of watch how it unfolds as you work with the schedule. So let me go back to my Gantt chart, and in this case, let's look at a few other elements that we have around cost. One of the fun parts about 2013 and higher is that if you click on the Report tab, you actually have a cost resource here in terms of business intelligence that's pre-built inside of this. So as I go through and I actually progress some work, mark it, I'll just say 100% complete, and I go over to my Report tab and say, well, what are the costs? Show me my cash flow. I literally have built-in business intelligence, which has pivot tables, fields where I can work, I can manage. And for those of you that haven't attended some of our business intelligence training, there's a lot of flexibility here because you have the entire pivot table, charting, graphing, reporting engine from Excel. You have Word and PowerPoint's formatting engine all nested inside a Project Standard and Project Professional. And again, as you move to an enterprise environment, all this information is accessible and available. So as we look at cost, or if we come back into our Report tab, you can go in and create what's called a task cost overview. So you can break this down. We can actually go in and say, hey, listen, I don't need to see, I'm looking for level 2. I want all of the top 2 summary tasks. So it could be the project level and then the series of sub-levels. Again, you can set what level of detail. You can apply filters and, of course, grouping around all of this. So the idea is that at a glance, we've got a quick BI. Here's my project summary, and I'm just telling it what level I want to look at. So all of this native inside of our project environment. Again, the client, you can save this as a PDF, good use and good values. If we go back to our Gantt chart, kind of continuing that story, you'll notice that I went to a view where I brought up a form. And for some of us old school Microsoft project users, we used to have something called the task entry view. And it actually still exists. It was one of the most powerful views in Project. And the idea is that if I go and I want to look at some of the information that I'm managing, so if I come into my View tab and I can go ahead and filter and sort, I have options to apply what are called tables. And again, as I went through it, I said, hey, listen, I can turn on a cost table. I can also go in and if I want to, from a view perspective, also turn on something called the details. And that's where, on a task-by-task basis, not only just showing the overall cost from the schedule perspective using a table, but I can come down here and I can actually click on a task and see the predecessor, successor, the work. And a lot of people go, oh, that's right. You know, we can actually go in and say, well, what's the resource? What are they doing? How many units? How many hours? And if you right-click down below in something called the details, you're able to turn on work or schedule. Or even as we get into, we talked about overtime. If you really want to see what the cost or the impact of overtime would be, you're going to have to go right here. And this is really the only place you can enter it in and say, hey, listen, I'm not just tracking hours. This is where I'll put in the overtime hours. And remember, from a cost perspective, if you have time and a half, you're going to see that roll in. But you'll need to use the details to see that. So again, right-clicking, going down to our cost detail on a task, and I can actually get into the nitty-gritty of what's the cost, the baseline, the actual, and of course, we can see that remaining. So native ingredients in your views are going to help you, whether it's a form or it's a task table, and you come up here and you go, hey, take me right out to my dashboard. Let's go take a look at my cost view. And the idea from cost is I might want to print my cost, and then I want to go back to my entry or my standard working view. Notice how quick and efficient, with a little bit of training, you can kind of pick up on these tips, tricks, and shortcuts to work with. Finally, as we go into the different types of views, so for example, let's leave our Gantt chart. Let's go into our resource usage view. I came out here and I right-clicked again, and this is where you're going to see where it says Detail Styles. So again, if I'm looking at showcasing different types of time phase data, we can see this. So again, if I want to zoom in and I come down and I start zooming and say, hey, listen, let's get down to a day at a glance. Let's break it down to 6 hours. Let's break it to 3 hours. We could break it to 15 minutes. And again, we can kind of zoom in and zoom out. The idea is that project is going to track your cost down to the minute. Now, hopefully you're not tracking that. You can certainly zoom out, or you can set your time scale to go, hey, just give me a week at a glance. That's really what I need to see. I know you may have started work on Monday, but I'm tracking this. Or maybe it's monthly. Give me a monthly snapshot of what this looks like. The value is understanding that you can turn on that cost detail versus just looking at your work detail. Again, notice I've done a lot of this demonstrating with the project, basically desktop tool. As we begin publishing and showcasing different views, this time phase data is all waiting and available. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go back into our Gantt chart, and I'm going to go ahead and just kind of run through a couple scenarios. Let's talk about how to utilize cost. So first of all, let's maybe start with something a little bit cleaner here. So I'm going to go ahead and zero out my tasks. So I've got no actuals in place. And I really do like having that table. So I'm going to start with my cost table. So I've got my cost, my fixed cost accrual. Again, at a task level, you can define whether it's at start or end. Notice we can do this for a task. We can also do this for individual resources as you assign them. So you've got some flexibility of saying, hey, when do I actually factor my time phase values? And of course, baseline, variance, and actuals. And of course, my favorite is what's left in the budget to work with. Now, what we need to do is go through and look at an assignment and watch how it behaves. Let's go back to that poor coordinate testing activities, and let's go through the scenario. So I'm going to take out travel for just a moment. And as we talked about, the types of resources that work. So as we begin to build a task, work, or cost view, I want to look at using some of the fields and how they're going to go together. So let me run through this with you, and I think you'll kind of see the pieces as they hop into place. So first and foremost, we've got a good table, fixed costs, baseline costs, actual remaining, and if I choose to do so, I could even do what's called a budget or a roll-up cost, or I could even just use my baseline, whichever makes sense for you. But let's go ahead and let's assign a resource to this task. We'll go ahead and add good old Chris, and I click on OK. Chris is not going to work at 100%. In fact, I'm just thinking all I'm doing as a PM is managing it. He tells me that he's only going to put in 16 hours worth of time. I click on OK, and notice it's factoring that cost. So what does that mean? If I double-click on Chris, I go into something called resource information, and here's where a little bit more advanced nuggets of knowledge are contained. Notice that I have a general tab that kind of gives me his overall availability. But if I sneak down here, I can actually see that I have a standard rate. Well, that's good if I'm tracking work and work activities as I begin starting February 2015 or February 2016. What if that in March 1st, Chris gets a pay raise, or as an organization, we're going to increase overall billing by 10%, or a vendor comes to you and says, hey, if you do it before this time period, it's going to be this rate. If you do it after this time period, it's something different. And remember, time and schedules kind of ebb and flow. So what we don't want to do is lose historical actuals by coming in and saying, well, listen, the new rate is $175 an hour, or it's, pay raise to $30,000 to $40,000 a year. What we want to do is make sure that we retain that. So as we come in here, I can actually use an effective date that says, you know what, if you're part of the federal program and we say October 1st is a whole new date, then maybe what we have is it's $175 per hour. Or if I type in 175 per M and hit enter, we can get into 175 a minute. Or if I type in 175 per W, /W, we can get into weekly rates. So when we look at that standard rate, you can actually play around with that as you work with it. But protecting the time-phased and historical rates in your schedule is what you can do when we add that resource. Again, it's going to calculate that based upon its time. All right. So as we know from an hour perspective, it's simply doing a multiplication, saying, hey, these hours times this rate, there you go. Now, if we look at time phase data, that's where this prorated, or we talk about start or end, we can actually see when those costs occur. So if I was to go back to a resource usage view, so let's pop over to resource usage, and let's go ahead and take a look at Chris. Now, Chris is over allocated. We can see that. And I come down here and say, hey, coordinating activities for IT, here it is, 16 hours. And I'm looking at the month of February, so maybe we want to look at this a little bit more granular. So let's go ahead and we'll just zoom maybe down to, let's just do it a week at a glance. So I'll go to my view, just set it to a week. There it is. I'll tighten this up a little bit so you can see this. And where in the world is that work? Let's go ahead and use our scroll to task button to take you. As I start looking at, here's his hours, I can also right-click and turn on that cost. Turn off work, look at cost. There it is. So we're breaking the numbers down. Now, if for some reason we start talking about an activity or a resource that's assigned to this, and we want to make sure that it's either front-loaded or back-loaded, meaning that we talk about prorated, if I went to my resource sheet view, and whoops, I went to task sheet. Let's go to resource sheet. And I took Chris and say, hey, Chris, he always invoices after the work is done. So we'll do it, put it at the end. And if I go back to my resource usage, again, that time phase view, you'll notice that while we might be tracking work, you can see that Chris is doing work, but it's not going to get charged until the very end. And again, this is allowing you that flexibility to manage some of the elements in place. So let's continue. So again, think about that. Prorated start end allows you to move where it starts and ends based upon the task activities. If I sneak back over to my Gantt chart, so let me go back to our Gantt chart, and we continue our story with our coordinating testing IT activities. This is where we would come in and say, well, listen, I am going to put in some material resources, right? And remember, I can say travel, I can say hardware and software as a material resource. The value, though, is the number of units. Now, think about that, the number of units. So if I come and say there's actually going to be $500 in travel costs, I would have to enter that in units. If I was going to enter a cost resource in, like travel by itself, which might be a cost, then I would actually have to change the view, go over to my cost, and I would simply enter that in, saying, hey, it's going to be $250. And so we would enter the actual cost value directly. So whether you're doing one or the other, the big difference between a cost and material is that when I go to mark something 50% complete, remember your actuals are not going to calculate for a cost resource if it's in a mixed environment. You would create a separate task for that and assign that directly. Again, up to you how you want to work and manage those pieces together. Okay. Now, overtime, that's another one that comes up quite frequently. It's not used commonly, but I want to show you how overtime works. The idea with that is I go to a work detail, and let's say that Chris is going to put some work in, but you know what, in order to make sure this gets done and gets done on time, he needs to put in 10 hours of overtime. In fact, if I put in 1,000 hours of overtime, 1, 2, 3, and say, rock and roll, Chris, 1,000 hours, notice it's trying to total up the amount of both work that was planned and how many overtime hours. Well, one of the things about overtime is you can't have overtime higher than the actual work on a task. So again, this is where undo comes in, saying, hey, listen, if you're going to put some overtime, I can't type more than 16 hours. I've got to say, look, overtime is always less than the actual work plan. But if I do put in and say 4 hours of overtime, and I click on OK, if we went and looked at Chris, right, so let's take a peek at Chris, and from a cost perspective, you know, we know that he has an effective hourly rate and what that is. But if I went to the resource sheet view and I said, you know what, let's give Chris some overtime. So Chris is going to go from $150 an hour to $800 an hour for overtime, especially if we give him any janitorial work. He hates doing that. So our goal, very quickly, is to come back and say, well, what's the impact? So now if I sneak out to our, in fact, let's just put him back at prorated so we can see this a little bit better. Let's go back to our resource usage view. Remember, we're looking at cost, and if I want to track coordinating testing activities that I want to see it maybe at a day at a glance, I can see very quickly and efficiently that, hey, listen, there are certain activities that once I add overtime, I can actually see that there's a cost impact to that. So the inherent idea is that if you want to track overtime, it will happen at a task level. you will have to add it into the details under the task form, and that's really the only place to make that happen. The value of what's called the overtime is that it does not impact overallocation. So for example, if I have Chris scheduled for work, and let's just take a look here, and we're looking at his overall hours, and I'm trying to see if Chris is double or triple booked on different activities. And if I begin looking at local activities or assignments, any resource, as we begin evaluating whether they're under or over in their assignments, we can actually see the roll-up of hours. Overtime does not enter in and cause an impact. That's not how that works. What it does is it allows you to ensure that you do get the hours of work done, the work is tracked, but it doesn't go and create what is called overallocation. So the value, of course, overtime is just a place to say, hey, look, I can actually put the labor in, perhaps see the cost, but at the same time, I don't need to worry about the over or under allocation in project. Okay, whoops, let's actually go back and to our Gantt chart. Finally, as we kind of wrap up here, and then I'm going to take some questions, is talking about our task and resource usage views. And I want to go back to that budget resource. So again, if I sneak back to my resource sheet here, and let's go ahead and actually make, we'll just go ahead and make travel right now a budget resource. Whoops, we can't do that because they're already assigned. So let's make them, because remember, they can only be assigned to the project summary task. So I've got software, and I'd like to make sure that I'm just going to budget for this. I'm not going to put it as a resource on a task. I don't care about time phase view. I'm just going to say, what's the overall roll-up of this? So as I go to my Gantt chart view, and I decide to enter cost, and you go, hey, I'd like to add that resource to this activity. So I go to my resource tab, and I assign resource, and I sneak down to software, and I go ahead and hit assign. Again, the idea is that I can come in here, and if you try and type in a number like 50,000 for software, it's not going to let you do that in assignment view. If you want to see that budget cost basically show up, so let me insert that column, budget, if I can type, budget cost, there we go, it's 0. But if I go to what's called either a task usage or a resource usage, this is the place that you're going to go and assign this. You need to assign it to a task usage or resource usage. So in this case, let's go to a task usage. It has a filter on the view, so somebody's changed it. So why don't we just go and put software. We'll click on OK. And then I'll just go over to my view, and I will turn off my filter. Great, there we go. Now what I can do is, if you look up here, I can see that, hey, there's software. And I can see software is actually assigned to my row 0. No, that might be a little bit an eye chart. But remember, task usage will list each task, and then it breaks down the resources that are assigned to those. That's where we can come in and enter in our cost. So in this case, if I would like to go ahead and right-click and insert the budget cost field, this is where I can type in 50,123. And now, without having to snap a baseline, I have a single place at the highest level in project that allows me at a glance to see overall budgets of what they were. So as I come in here, I can see the budget versus the cost. Wow, we really are in trouble. But that was just for software, right? So the idea is that you can put a budget cost to have that show up. Again, looking at some of those views are going to help you validate and manage that. Now, I'm going to take a few minutes for questions. I think this is really helpful. I've covered some pretty heavy topics and drill into that. Again, there's scenarios that we can get into, but let's take some questions before we wrap up today. Anna, any questions?
Yeah, let's get started. Can you integrate costs from external systems to projects?
Oh, wow, that's a great topic. Listen, if you are very interested in that, we actually wrote a white paper called Integrating Project with SAP. And the concept is absolutely valid. In fact, as it's moved forward in later versions in project, it's gotten even easier. The questions that people ask is, how do we integrate, project level cost to a project? Well, the idea is that you need to marry two systems together. And there's a couple approaches, and I'll just be very brief. But the idea is that if you have a project ID or a task ID or a PO or work order, you need a unique identifier to marry those two systems together. In many cases, you can actually run an extract out of your accounting system and import that directly. You just need to know where to marry those two systems or pieces together. The bigger question is to track, is cost going at the file level, meaning the project level fields, or is it down to the task level fields? So we've written a white paper on that. In fact, I spoke at the project conference a couple years ago on this, showing different capabilities. And there were some people out there that were, I'll say, partners that were grumpy because I was kind of showcasing, as magicians do, the magic behind the curtains. But in today's day and age, that is a very common practice. Another approach is not necessarily to force-feed cost information into your accounting system or force it into Microsoft Project or Project Online or Project Server, is to use SharePoint in your business intelligence to actually marry that together in a BI report. So you've got some flexibility to kind of think through how you want to manage that. Of course, having actual costs coming in from your ERP system at a task or a project level means you've got all the power of project to do views, groups, and updates. But there's some work behind that. So great question. Thanks, Anna.
Sure thing.
Next
And
question.
I think we have time for one more. Here we go. Can you have more than 5 rate tables?
Somebody was paying attention in this session. Let me go back to my resource sheet here. So, and this is a great question. Let me double click on poor Chris, right? So we talked about having a cost rate table where we can have a series of effective dates. And again, this scrolls down. There's quite a few here. If you just scroll down, you can say, hey, on this date it changes. But if you notice here, there are different rate tables that you could have different costs. So for example, if we say, hey, Chris charges $150 for doing this type of work, but you know when he does that janitorial stuff, he charges $800 an hour. And when I click on OK, the idea is, if I go back to that resource usage view, and let's go pick on poor Chris, and I'm looking at Chris here, and I go and I say, hey, let's turn on the cost, and I can see, hey, it's about X number of dollars for 8 hours worth of work. Well, what if I change that to a different rate table? Watch this. In your usage views, you can put in what's called a cost rate table. And you can actually choose which rate table you are using. And the nice thing about this is that if you say, hey, listen, it's going to be rate table B, watch the numbers. Did you see that? So let me change that back to A, wax on, B, wax off. The question was asked was, can there be more than 5 rate tables? And the short answer is, at this point in time in the Microsoft project world, there cannot be more than 5 rate tables. There's some strategies of how to get around this, but I will tell you that the product team is actually working on this now. Our last objective domain that we had at the Partner Advisory Council was to really help extend this out, as organizations do have flexibility for different rate tables. Fantastic question. That's definitely a deep nugget of information. So, Anna, back to you.
Okay, and I think with that, we're coming to the close of our time together. And so, Tim, I really want to thank you for your presentation this morning. Definitely, I found it very helpful, and hopefully the rest of us on the call did as well. Just a quick couple things, and then we will release you back to the day. So for those of you who have joined our weekly webinars, you know that we are passionate about continuing this conversation. We love spending this hour with you, but also want to make sure we're delivering on giving you the value you need to expand on what we've covered today. We have a couple different ways to do that. We can go ahead and spin up a free trial and a demo for your team in case you're wanting to get more familiar with the technology we've covered today, or even those listed on the screen in front of you. We're more than happy to do that for you and your team. As I mentioned before, our consultants would love to go ahead and interact with you and just do everything from a quick troubleshoot to validating you guys are on the right path. So if you feel like you need that second set of eyes, feel free to reach out to us. We are happy to spin up a consulting session free of charge. And also, we have public classes here in our headquarter facility in Vancouver, Washington. So please go ahead and check out our website. They're a lot of fun and interactive and in person. So we also offer custom training. If you're not seeing the topic that you need, we're more than happy to accommodate and custom create a class that's going to fit your needs. And we have no problem coming on site as well if that would be more beneficial. Okay, last note, and it's all about PDUs. This session does count for one PDU. If you go ahead and fill out that short survey upon the close of this webinar, that's all you need to do in order to get PDU information from me. I'm typically able to send out the PDU information on Friday. So if you encounter any issues, please feel free to let me know. And most importantly, again, as I said in the beginning, these sessions are geared for you guys. So if you love the session, if you have identified ways that we could improve the session, we're here and very interested in that feedback. So please feel free to reach out and either fill it in on the survey or shoot me an email or give me a call. At this point, I will go ahead and close the session. But again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us this morning. We really appreciate it.